Hey everybody. I am back today to do another Bible study with you. We are going to talk about two women together named Ruth and Naomi. What I want you to know about the story before we begin is that this story it has so many different elements that are beautiful that relate to how we can see the relationship between Jesus and ourselves. And that's not so much between the two women as it is with Ruth herself. So let's just kind of dive right in. Ruth and Esther are the only two books in the Bible that you will see named after women. And there is a pretty good reason for that. These two women were significant in similar ways, but vastly different in others. So Ruth was a Moabite woman that ended up marrying a Jewish man, and she wound up being in the lineage of Jesus Christ because of faithfulness that she had, and because she saw something while she was married to that man that made her understand that Yahweh, the one true God, was the one true God. That these little images and dolls that people worshipped were not real God. So anyway, let's kind of get into it. Naomi and her husband Elimelech were a couple that lived in Judah. They were from Bethlehem, and there was a famine, and so they picked up their family and they moved. And they moved to Moab, and they were there long enough that their sons were able to grow up some and marry themselves. So you have one man whose name is Mahlon, and that is the one that Ruth marries. There's another one named Killian who his wife's name was Orpah. So both of these men are married. You've got a family of 6. There were no children from either of those marriages. So time passes and Naomi loses her husband. And then both of the women, both of her daughter-in-laws lose their husbands. So Naomi loses both of her sons and her husband while she lives in Moab. It really doesn't say from what, it just says that they died. So Naomi finds out that the famine in Judah is over, and she decides she's going home. There's nothing for her here. There's not a reason for her to stay here. She's just going to go home and be with her own people. So she packs up all of her stuff, and she gets ready to leave. And she tells her daughter-in-laws, you don't owe me anything. My sons are gone. There's not a reason for you to stay with me. You should go home to your people and to your gods. I mean, she specifically says your people and your gods. And I'm not really sure why she would say it that way, other than maybe there had been an issue at some point where there was some contention about whose God was real. Now, that's Priscilla talking. That's not Bible, okay? So I guess what I want you to know here, what I want you to understand really well before we get into the story, is that Ruth she's nobody. She's not anything special in society. Now she's a widow. So, widows were actually looked down on if they didn't have a male provider. But, she wasn't influential. She wasn't famous. She wasn't high society. She was just a regular person. And the reason I want you to understand that is because you will see later that when she, as the story advances, she becomes part of the lineage of Jesus. She's David's great grandmother. I'll figure that out here in a minute. I got to think it. I have to think about it in my head for a minute. Anyway, so all of these women are kind of grieving, and Naomi is telling her daughter-in-laws, go home. And Orpah at first acts like she wants to stay, but she ends up changing her mind. Naomi is okay with her changing her mind because she's kind of insisting that they go home. Ruth, on the other hand, the Bible says that she clung to her mother-in-law. So she's holding on to her and she's just clinging to her, and she's saying, I don't want to go home. I don't want to go back to that life. I want to stay with you. And she is so determined to stay that Naomi finally accepts that that's really what she wants to do. And so she's going to let her. But there's a couple of verses here that I want to read to you specifically, because the proclamation that Ruth made to Naomi to express how much she did not want to leave her is quite beautiful. So in Ruth 1, chapter 1, verses 16 and 17, it says, entreat me not to leave you or to turn back from following after you. For wherever you go, I will go. And wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. And the Lord does so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me. Those are some pretty strong words if you break that down. She's basically telling her, I'm begging you, don't ask me to leave. Please don't ask me. She says, I want to go where you go. I want to be where you are. I don't want to live where you're not. I want to live where you are. And she tells her, I want to become part of your people. She knew that she was a Jew. She's telling her, I want to be part of the Jewish community. Your God is my God. She was telling her, I don't accept the pagan gods anymore. I want Yahweh to be my God as well. And then she goes so far as to say, I want to live and be buried in the same place with you, and heaven forbid that we are separated. So she's telling Naomi how much that she loves and respects her, and that she's seen something during their time together that she doesn't want to lose. She has seen something that has proven to her that the God of the Israelites is the one true God. And so she wants to continue to serve God as well. She could have returned to her own family. She could have returned to things that were familiar to her from her early life. But maybe those things weren't good. Maybe those things were not positive, and she had found something positive in the relationship that she had with her husband and his family. But again, that's my speculation. But she didn't want to try and keep her own beliefs. She wanted to continue to have the same beliefs and the same life that she'd had up to that point with Naomi. So they travel back to Bethlehem, which is where Naomi was from. And it's time of the barley harvest when they get there. And, in those days, whenever it was harvest season, everybody was out working. You didn't really have too many people that weren't in the fields doing the work. Whole families would be out there trying to harvest. If they didn't harvest, they didn't eat. So when they return back to Bethlehem, there are women who recognize Naomi, and they call out to her and they're like, are you Naomi? I mean, she's been gone for 10 years, so they're trying to make sure that it's really her. And she tells them to call her Mara, not Naomi. And the reason why is because Mara is, it basically means she was bitter. She felt like God had dealt her too much tragedy, that she had lost way too much. She tells them that she had gone out of their country full and she returns to them empty. Basically, I left here with a bright future with my husband and my sons. I was looking forward to grandchildren and what my life was going to be like. And all of that has been taken away from me. And now I'm returning with nothing. I have my daughter-in-law, which doesn't have any children. So she feels like she's just lost everything. And in that society, if you didn't have a male to take care of you, it was really difficult for them to survive. You had to have someone that could manage the daily life that they had to have then. Men were the leader of the household. And so it was not normal for a woman to be on her own. And now that she didn't have a husband or sons, it was going to be difficult for her. Also, men is who property was typically passed through. And so women really didn't own very much in those days. You had to have a male that was responsible for you. I'm trying to figure out how to say this correctly. Women were chattel. We were property. We didn't make very many decisions for ourselves. We followed whatever the male or the leader of the family told us to do. And these women were without that. So in order for them to get food, they were going to have to rely on the goodwill of someone else. And normally they would have to gather the leftovers from the fields after the workers had gotten in the crops. Now, I want you to understand that Ruth had to have been paying attention to the things that her husband and her father-in-law talked about, because she knew something of Levitical law even before she got there. In Leviticus chapter 19, verses 9 and 10, it says, "When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not wholly reap the corners of your fields, nor shall you gather the gleanings of your harvest. And you shall not glean your vineyard, nor shall you gather every grape of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the stranger. I am the Lord your God." So he made it clear to the Jewish people that there were some, like these widows, that were not going to have one to care for them. They were not going to have someone that was going to be able to provide for them. And if you were a devout Jew, that you would leave some food for those who had no other way to get it. And so Ruth tells Naomi that she's going to try and obtain some food for them. So she chooses to try and glean from a particular field. And I believe it was God's hand at work that the field that she chose to try and glean from or get some harvest from was from a man named Boaz. Now, Ruth did not realize that Boaz was kin to Naomi's late husband, Elimelech. And like I said, everything passes through the men of the family. So if it had been Naomi's family, it wouldn't have been the same. It had to have been from her father-in-law's family. And so this is the family of Elimelech. And in Ruth 2:1, you can see where that connection is made. Now he saw Ruth working in the field, and he asks one of the servants if they know who she is. And the servant tells him about her, tells him that she's been caring for her mother-in-law, and tells him that Naomi is her mother-in-law, and basically kind of gives him the rundown of how this woman came to be in his field, and she's just doing what Levitical law tells her that she can do. She's not trying to go in there and get harvest out of the area where his servants are harvesting. She is literally doing what Levitical law tells her, and she's trying to get the portions on the side. And if you know anything about farming, you'll know that the crops on the side and in the corners don't tend to grow as well as the crops in the center. So it would have been more difficult for her to obtain food that she needed, or grain that she needed. So the servant also tells him that she's been working really hard to try and gather food for both of them. So Boaz goes to Ruth, and he tells her that instead of gleaning from the side, she can work alongside the women in his field. She can eat of their food and drink of their water, and that no one will bother her, because he's talked to the men and he's told them, don't bother her. And on top of that, he doesn't tell her this, but he tells the servants, he says, leave a little extra for her so that she can get what she needs in order to survive. Now, Ruth doesn't understand what she's done to earn his favor, and so she asks him why. Why have I earned your favor? I'm a stranger to your land. You don't know me. Why are you being so kind? And so Boaz tells her that he has been told about how she's caring for her mother-in-law. And I think he appreciated the fact that this young woman was doing something that a lot of people would not have done. Most people would not have stayed with Naomi. They would have went back to where they came from so that they could, have a new sense of normal. As far as that goes, in her own country, she may have been able to remarry, and who knows what her life would have been like. But that wasn't God's plan. And Ruth was selected for a good reason. She had a beautiful heart. If you can hear my son screaming in the background, that's him yelling at his video game, and I apologize. So he blesses her, and he tells her that he prays that she finds the refuge and the reward from the Lord that she is seeking. And so she goes home, and Naomi sees what Ruth is bringing home, and she hears of what's happened, and she begins to see a way in her mind that maybe she can offer this daughter-in-law that's been so kind to her and has loved her a new way of security, because she understands that Boaz was kinsman to Elimelech. So there's something that we're going to talk about here in a moment where they had something called the kinsman redeemer. And basically what this boiled down to is that, to keep property in the family, if a man died, his brother could take over the man's wife and children, take over their care, and he would then obtain the property of his brother so that he could keep it in the family. But in order to do that, he must also care for his family. You didn't get to just take the property and leave the wife and kids to suffer. You had to agree to take that wife and that family. All right, so Naomi's wheels are turning in her head, and she's thinking, okay, well, Boaz is kin. We may have ourselves a kinsman redeemer. So anyway, she tells Ruth to clean up and dress nicely, and for her to go to the threshing house and put herself at the feet of Boaz. And she tells her, she says, don't bother him while he's eating and drinking. Wait until he lays down to go to sleep. All right, so the reason for that is because in those days, a servant would sleep at the master's feet. It would show humility. It would show servitude. Basically, you were telling the person that you were sleeping at the bottom of their feet, I'm putting my life in your hands because I'm trusting you to care for me and be the master in my life, to be the one who is the leader in my life. And so Ruth does that. She goes and she waits until Boaz falls asleep. And it says somewhere around midnight, he wakes up. What wakes him most likely is her. She has taken a piece of his cloak and covered part of herself with it. This was another example of, you're my master, so you're going to provide for me. And so the master's covering with the cloak was acceptance of the master to take over the care of this person. And so Boaz did go ahead and cover her with his cloak. And she called him a redeeming kinsman. So he tells her that he's touched, that not only is she putting her trust in him because she really doesn't know him beyond what he's done for her so far and maybe what she's learned from listening to other people talk. But he appreciates that she trusts him and that she showed a great maturity and good character by not running around trying to go to the best looking person or to try and find the richest guy or, things that people will do because they're desperate to try and make their life easier. That's not really what she's doing. She's trying to get someone who will be a good husband. And she sees redeeming qualities in him that would be good for her life as well. So he even calls her righteous in the eyes of his people, which means something because this is a Moabite woman. She's not a Jew. She is from Moab. And basically, his people see something really good and wholesome in her. They see qualities in her that they can appreciate. So the reason that this story is important, like I said, is you can have an inference of the relationship between Ruth and Boaz as what God is as the kinsman redeemer. So Boaz is related to her through her late husband, therefore a blood relative, and he was capable of being the kinsman redeemer. We've talked about how you needed to be under the protection of a man, whether it was the spouse or a father, and you needed that male protector, because if you didn't have someone to protect you, you were just basically left to your own devices. And that, as a woman in those days, that was not a good thing. But what a kinsman redeemer was a man or a male relative that would accept the responsibility to help a relative in need or in danger. So in order to get this, Boaz still had to pay a price in order to get the property and Ruth. And it specifically says that he purchased the property and her as his wife. Now, Jesus fits in this role for many reasons. Number one, he redeems us. He pays our debts. He marries us into the family of God. He accepts responsibility for our sins, and he restores us to what we once were. So, these women who were on the outskirts of society because they were widows now become a good, valid part of society because they have that redemption of a man who came into their lives and accepted that responsibility. Jesus married us into the family, so we are grafted into the line. We are not Jews, most of us. We're Gentiles. But yet we can still receive the promise of Abraham, which is kind of what he did for her. Because he married her, he grafted her into the line of the Jews. They were going to have a child that was going to continue the lineage and be able to bring forth David, which was extremely important in the lineage of Jesus Christ. And so the kinsman redeemer is something that was a law that was written in Leviticus. So if you want to learn a little bit more about that, you can go back to Leviticus and read about the kinsman redeemer. In Exodus, God told them that he would be the redeemer by freeing them from their bondage. And Leviticus 25, chapter 25, verses 25 through 28 tells us that, or tells us what the law in the says, if thy brother be waxen poor and hath sold away some of his possessions, and if any of his kin come to redeem it, then shall he redeem that which his brother sold. And if the man have none to redeem it, and himself be able to redeem it, then let him count the years of the sale thereof, and restore the overplus unto the man to whom he sold it, that he may return unto his possession. But if he be not able to restore it to him, then that which is sold shall remain in the hand of him that hath bought it until the year of Jubilee. And in the Jubilee it shall go out, and he shall return unto his possession. So what he's saying there, or what they're saying there, is that if something happens and that man loses his property because he has debts, and he's able to get the money to repay those debts, then you have to sell him back his property. If he's unable to ever raise that money, then when the Jubilee year happens, which is every 50 years, that possession would return to his family. It may not necessarily return to him, but it would return to his family. You have to remember, we're talking about tribes here, and there were specific tribes allotted specific areas whenever they crossed into the promised land. God didn't want there to be confusion, and you had intermarrying that would happen every once in a while, but he wanted those tribes to have that particular part of the promised land. And so every 50 years, whatever property had changed hands would go back to its original family. So Ruth and Boaz's story is it's actually a very sweet story. And you can look at it more than one way. Naomi is repeatedly reminded of God's goodness because of Ruth's love and loyalty to her. Ruth did not have to be how she was. She could have left just like Orpah did. And Naomi would have went home and probably grieved herself to death because she was still grieving when she got home. That was the reason that she called herself Mara. She just felt like she'd lost everything. But here is this daughter-in-law that God has blessed her with that stays loyal to her and continues to show her love even when she didn't have to. If Ruth had not returned to Judah with Naomi, she probably would have had no hope, because her hope ended up coming in the form of seeing a way out of their situation through the Redeemer, who was a kinsman to her husband. And so now all of a sudden, she's got some hope. We, like Naomi, are without hope if we don't have God. If we do not have God there is no hope for us after this life. You know, and quite honestly, without him in this life, there's not a lot of good. I mean, I've walked in this life for many years without God, and I promise you it's so much better with him in it. And that's, and I can say that even with everything I've been through. If you don't know me, quickly, I've had cancer twice. My dad had cancer at the same time I did. I've lost many, many family members, and in the last year, I've lost 3. My dad's cousin lost one of his 28-year-old sons. I lost my cousin, my first cousin, to murder, and on December 22nd, I lost my baby brother. So if I can tell you that there is hope and that there is still goodness in this life with God and not without, I think maybe you should listen to what I'm saying, because I know what pain is. I know what grief is. I know how hard it is to be on the face of this planet at this time. And I'm telling you that our one and only hope is God. All right, so Ephesians 2:12 says that at that time ye were without Christ, being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers from the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. That's us. That's us without God. But because Ruth loved her mother-in-law and followed her back, she was going to be the instrument that was used by God to give hope back to Naomi. She delivered her a son whose name was Obed. And I'll get to that in a minute. So if you read that story, you will find out that Boaz goes to the place where the men meet and they get together and they discuss things. And there actually was one other man who was closer in kin to Naomi, or well, I guess to Elimelech, than what Boaz was. And he was willing to accept the property, but he was not willing to accept Ruth. And so he told Boaz, he said, if you're willing to accept the property and her, then, I'm going to let this pass to you. And Boaz was tickled because he did want Ruth. He did want her to be his wife. And so he accepted her. And they had a tradition, and I don't know what it means yet. I'm going to try and figure it out. But whenever they would agree on something like this, they would give the other one their shoe. I don't know what that means yet, but I'm going to figure that out. But regardless, so you have Boaz and Ruth that get married. And history tells us that just shortly after they got married, Boaz dies. But he was able to achieve what was the will of God by giving Ruth a son. And his name, like I said, was Obed. In verse 14, at the end of the book, it tells you, and the women said unto Naomi, Blessed be the Lord, which hath not left thee this day without a kinsman, that his name may be famous in Israel, and he shall be unto thee a restorer of thy life, and a nourisher of thine old age. For thy daughter-in-law, which loveth thee, which is better to thee than 7 sons, hath borne him. And Naomi took the child, and laid it in her bosom, and became nurse unto it. And the women, her neighbors, gave it a name, saying, There is a son born to Naomi, and they called his name Obed. He is the father of Jesse, who is the father of David. So Ruth was grafted into this very famous lineage because God used her, and she allowed God to use her to keep that line going. That line was important. And had she not done what she did, like I said, Boaz ended up dying. You know, I don't know of any other sons that he had, but this son that he had, Obed, was very important. He was the grandfather to David, King David. So, you know, this is kind of huge. And I think it's fitting that Ruth became the instrument of this because she had a sweet spirit. She had a good soul. She had a good heart. And that is seen through the actions of what she did. There are 5 women that are listed in the genealogy of Jesus. And she's one of them. And I think, like I said, I think the virtues that she showed were very desirable of someone that you would expect to be in that line. She was humble and she was kind. And what's interesting about that is she was from a nation that was openly hostile against Israel. They didn't like the Jews. And so that she chose to stay with Naomi and worship God shows that, you know, number one, she saw something in that relationship between those people and God that she wanted. She wanted what they had. And she knew the only way to get that was to stay with Naomi. If she went home, Yahweh was not something that the people in Moab worshiped. You know, they didn't like the Jews. It also shows that God is impartial. He used this Gentile woman to become very instrumental in his own lineage. And just because her countrymen hated the Jews, that didn't disqualify her from the love of God. You know, if she had continued to go down the road that they had taught her as a youth, you know, it wouldn't have kept God from loving her, just would have kept her from achieving her purpose. But her willingness to come to God and allow him to bless her and bring her into his kingdom is what made this story possible. If you look at Matthew chapter 1, verses 1 through 16, that is the lineage of Jesus. And Ruth, Tamar, Rahab, Bathsheba, and Mary are the ones that are listed in the line of Jesus. Ruth is the first one. We will talk about Tamar, we will talk about Rahab, and we will talk about Bathsheba, just in case you don't know those names. Most people know about Mary. We are going to talk about her as well, though. Ruth is seen as such a positive story because she had humility, and her love for Naomi allowed her to let Naomi help her get security and safety again. Naomi helped her to learn how to trust God. And, you know, doing things the right way is not always easy, but doing things the right way is always the best way to honor God. And when Ruth made her choice, she never looked back. Her life became something beautiful because of her willingness to be humble and to love. So if you wish to, you can read the story of Ruth. Like I said, the book of Ruth is the story. And it's not terribly long, but it is a beautiful story. If you have any takes on how Ruth was used in a different way that maybe I said, I'd love to hear about it. I'm going to move on to a few other of these today, because I've been working on these pretty diligently lately, and I hope that you'll forgive me for being so spotty about putting these Bible studies on here. As I said, we have really had a lot of grief in the last several months. So I ask that you pray for my family as we continue to grieve. We understand that with God, everything has a purpose. We may not see it because it's not always evident. And I feel like this story gives me hope, because not only did Naomi lose her sons and her husband, but Ruth lost her husband. And she could have been bitter like Naomi was, but she wasn't. She stayed loving, she stayed humble, and she continued to let God use her. And I really hope that even though things have been hard for us in my family, that I can continue to be like Ruth, that I can stay humble, and that I can continue to let God use me to make someone else's life better and maybe give them support that they would not have. I am always here if anybody needs to talk. I will say this one thing, and then I'm going to close. If suicide ever crosses your mind, if you feel like no one cares, or that God doesn't love you, if you hear those demons whispering in your ear that you're better off dead, you wonder if people's life wouldn't be better without you, please call me. Please. Because I'm telling you, I will walk you off of that ledge as fast as I can. Those are all lies of the devil. The devil uses things, difficult situations, and he likes to use your poor decisions as a weapon against you. If you ever are in that situation, please call me. Because I care. And because I will happily tell you how much that God loves you and how important you are to him. The Bible tells us that every single soul that is saved causes a celebration in heaven. Just one soul coming to God causes a party in heaven. I want you to be that one soul. I want you to be that one person that they can throw a party because you came to God and you saw that he does love you. He loves you so much that he came and died for you. So I won't harp on that for long. I'm going to move on, and we're going to talk about Abigail next. That one will be short and sweet. And then after that, we will talk about Jezebel. So God bless you. I am praying for you. Please continue to pray for me and my family, that God give us strength and peace, and let us be able to get through this. Thank you very much. God bless you. I love you. Goodbye.